110 on Lennon. Please welcome producer, director, and writer, a trustee of the London Library, Rick Stroud.
Good morning. It's a very, very great pleasure to be able to introduce the author of this wonderful book, Victor Sebestyen, who I've known for quite a long time as a member of the London Library, where we both write, and I've always thought of him as being a quiet, reclusive scholar. I couldn't be more wrong. He's actually a globe-trotting man of action. He's covered the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. He's a distinguished journalist and a contributing editor to the London Times, the New York Times, the Evening Standard, the Daily Mail, and Newsweek, and that is a pretty impressive list. He's also a scholar and a historian, and his prodigious literary output includes 1946, The Making of the Modern World, Revolution 1989, The Fall of the Soviet Union, and 12 Days, the story of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, something which Victor's very close to because of his family is Hungarian. And now Lenin, the Man, the Dictator, and the Master of Terror. It's a wonderful book. It's clearly and beautifully written, but it has a sort of thriller-like style. It's the first biography in English for about 20 years, meticulously researched with a wealth of new material about Lenin, the man who desired good but created evil. One critic has said that Sebestyen has produced a first-rate thriller by detailing the cynicism and murderous ambition of the founder of the Soviet Union. The New York Times review of books goes further. The critic there asks, how can first-rate history read like a thriller? With Lenin, the Man, the Dictator, and the Master of Terror, Sebestyen has pulled off that rarest of feats down to the last of the 569 pages. I mean, it's a true-life Russian version of the House of Cards. Sebestyen has a scriptwriter's knack for drama and suspense. This is a book, the critic wrote, to enthrall the history buff and professional alike. So will you join me, please, in welcoming the author of this wonderful work, Victor Sebestyen.
Well, thank you, Rick, for those very, very kind words. I'm very grateful. I'm so happy to be here in Jaipur, a city I've absolutely loved from the very first time I came here 45 years ago now. But sadly, I haven't been recently. But I have very, very many happy memories that have come flooding back over the last few days when I was here. I've done talks in Britain, in the US, throughout Europe about this book and about the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution last year. But it's so interesting to talk about Lenin here and to discuss the subject of this book, because when you look at the legacy that Lenin left to the world, it's probably much greater here than anywhere else, in Asia than anywhere else, for good or ill. It was the communists and Lenin, and a huge contribution to the end of imperialism and the encouragement of anti-colonialist liberation struggle, and Lenin himself ensured there'd be massive amounts of money from Comintern, given at a time when Russia itself was going through a civil war, there was massive starvation. He was giving huge amounts of money to the liberation movements throughout the developing world, in the belief that he always had to his dying day, that there would be world revolution. And of course, even now, there are 148 statues to Lenin in India itself. I read this from an Indian academic just a couple of years ago, and they may not exist quite so many now, but there were that many. And the classic statue was Lenin posing with his hand outstretched, pointing to the way of the future. Of course, nowadays it's usually pointing to a supermarket, but such is progress, I suppose. And the influence of Lenin and the communists in Asia persists, more so than in the West. And China may have dispensed with communism in this race towards the free market, but it's run by communists and the one-party state, and the idea of the one-party state was the invention of Lenin. And of course there's North Korea, again, one-party state, and it's very much in the news. So the legacy of Lenin lives on in our world today in a very real way. And also it struck me recently just how modern Lenin is and how he would have slotted in very easily into the ideologically driven age and this uncertain age we're in now. He's highly, highly relevant, much more so than when I began writing the book over 4 years ago now. Lenin would without a doubt, see the present age as a revolutionary moment, when, as he put it, the masses are no longer willing to be led in the old ways, and the leaders can't lead in the traditional way. When people have stopped believing in the certainties of previous generations, as I think we have throughout the world, this is a time ripe for Lenin's. And though he seized power in a coup d'etat, he didn't operate entirely through terror. In many ways, he's absolutely a thoroughly modern political phenomenon, familiar to us in democracies as well as in dictatorships. In his quest for power, he promised people anything and everything. He lied unashamedly. He offered very simple solutions to complex problems. He would have been brilliant on Twitter. Though he could be really long-winded and prolix at times, he could be amazingly pithy. The big revolutionary slogan in the revolutionary year 1917 that basically won him power were peace, land, bread. That's what he promised people. It's a lot less than 140 characters. And he'd have been superb on radio. And then his other thing that's very modern is he identified a scapegoat that he could later identify as an enemy of the people. He justified himself on the basis that winning meant everything. The end justified the means. Anyone who's endured elections in the supposedly sophisticated political cultures throughout the world might recognize him. Lenin was the godfather of what we call nowadays post-truth politics. When you have a man like Steve Bannon, erstwhile chief strategist to an American president in the White House, he may have gone now, but he was very influential to Trump, with Trump for a while, who saw himself and called himself openly, oh, I'm a Leninist, I want to break down everything and start afresh. Well, when that happens, you know the world is turning upside down. I was fascinated by the figure of Lenin for a long time, well before I started this book. From my first visit to Russia 45 years ago. There aren't that many big historical figures that one wants to write big biographies about who you can still see in a bizarre, albeit macabre way. And that's how I started this book, because it was the image of Lenin still there and the embalmed body was very significant. And if you don't mind, I'll read a passage from my book just to give you a flavour of how I write and how I present my case. Could anyone bring me some water by any chance? Sorry. On one side of Moscow's Red Square, there remains a site familiar to anyone who knew the late Soviet Union in the communist years. Every day, long lines of people queue patiently for a ticket to visit Lenin's mausoleum, set within a huge marble plinth erected in the 1920s. The wait can last an age, the tour itself just moments. Visitors enter a basement and walk along a bare corridor for a few meters in eerie semi-darkness. Sorry, thank you very much. Sorry about this, I'm just dying of... Powerful lights illuminate the embalmed body, which has been lying in this tomb on plush red velvet for nearly 90 years. There's such a crush of people still that they're given a maximum of 5 minutes to pay their respects, or simply to gawp. A few of the visitors are foreigners, the vast majority are Russians. It's a macabre place to go sightseeing in the mid-21st century, whoever is entombed there. But 2.5 decades after the collapse of the USSR, it seems the strangest of anachronisms that Vladimir Ilyich Lenin can continue to draw such crowds. Everyone knows the havoc he wreaked. Few people now believe in the faith he espoused, yet he still commands attention, even affection, in Russia. The present Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, has no intention of getting rid of this tomb. Rather, in 2011, he authorized vast expenditure to repair the mausoleum when there was a danger it would fall down. The Lenin cult survives, if in an altered form. Putin's grandfather, Spiridon, was Lenin's cook after the Russian Revolution, but it is not the current president's family sentiment that has kept Lenin's remains in situ. The clear signal is to show historical continuity, the idea that Russia still needs, as it has always needed, a dominant, ruthless, autocratic leader, a boss, in Russian, the vozhd. Lenin's tomb once symbolized an internationalist ideology, world communism. It has since become an altar of resurgent Russian nationalism. And Lenin had a very direct influence and effect on my own life. My family, as Rick mentioned, went to Britain as refugees when I was just a baby from Hungary, a state forged in the image of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, at least at that time in the 50s. I wouldn't be here today if it had not been for Lenin. Later, when I became a journalist, I worked in the former Soviet Union a great deal and in the countries behind the Iron Curtain. One of the most exciting moments of my life was in November 1989, when Lenin's depressing legacy, the Berlin Wall, came tumbling down. Still later, when I came to write history, I wrote 3 books about the Cold War: the middle, the end, and the start of the Cold War, in that order. It just seemed right and logical when I thought what to do next, to go back to the original roots, how it all began, and to the figure who started it all, Lenin. It seemed an inescapable progression, logical. And my aim in this book is to write about Lenin the man rather than Lenin as an idea. There have been many biographies of him before, at least 150, and that's in English, and another 1,000 roughly throughout the Soviet years in Russian. but there wasn't one in English for nearly 20 years, which is partly why I wrote it. And that has been part of the problem, getting to the real Lenin rather than Lenin as a figurehead. Many of the books have been excellent, but they tended to be from one side or the other in the ideological divide that was Cold War. He was either the pillar of Bolshevik rectitude, that he could do no wrong, the cuddly Dyadushka Lenin that generations of Soviet children were brought up to revere. Even the last Soviet leader who did more to destroy communism than anyone else, Mikhail Gorbachev, used to call Lenin a special genius. Or on the other side, many, many biographies in the West, he was the evil genius who created one of history's cruelest tyrannies. To a biographer, the political is the personal, as Lenin himself used to say quite often. And I lived with this man for 3.5 years, which is rather longer than is entirely healthy for anyone, I can assure you. At the end of it, I was more impressed by him, but hated him rather more when Lenin the person emerged. He impressed me just because it was astonishing how a figure who for most of his life had 12 followers and living in small Western cities could take over one of the largest empires in the world. It's to a journalist, to a storyteller, it is a fantastically interesting, vital story. He's entirely different from the figure of his reputation when you look at him carefully, from either side of the political divide. He wasn't icy or logical or one-dimensional, as he's so often portrayed. He was highly emotional and flew into rages that almost crippled him. He was, of course, shrewd, brilliant, an anatomist of power, and horrifyingly ruthless, as we all know. He was a fanatical ideologue, but only up to a point. He was also a very, very practical man of action. While other people, there were lots and lots of Russian revolutionaries from the 1880s onward living in Western capitals. Most of them were quite happy to sit there in cafes on the left bank in Paris discussing finer points of ideology. Lenin believed he could achieve the revolution and showed a practical way forward to do it, and that was his gift. His great book, What Is to Be Done, is still a guidebook for political action to many radical figures. When ideology conflicted with tactics, Lenin would invariably pick the tactical path, which is why he succeeded and the others failed. He was driven by anger and a thirst for revenge as much as by ideology. When Lenin was 17, his elder brother, Alexander, was executed. For taking part in an assassination plot to kill the then Tsar Alexander III. That radicalized Lenin overnight. He had not thought at all about politics before that. He wasn't involved at all. He was much more interested in boating along the river. But it wasn't just the execution of his revered brother. What happened, and this shows to me how personality is so important in history, is that when his mother wanted to go to plead for his son Alexander's life, Lenin was dispatched to find someone to accompany her on a visit. He could find absolutely no one in bourgeois provincial in the city where he came from, Simbirsk, to go with his mother, and that fueled a revenge, a hatred of the bourgeois liberals, absolutely to his dying day. He hated the bourgeois liberals far more than he hated outright Tsarists, and that absolutely forged his politics as much as as any Marxist ideas of the theory of surplus value. But there all kinds of other things about Lenin emerged which I didn't know about, and which those unfamiliar with him, well, I'm sure would be interested. He wrote all these texts on philosophy and socialist economics, and there's quite a bit about that in my book. But there's also about Lenin's love for mountains, which he adored even more than he loved making revolution. And he wrote lyrically on letters recently found in archives, which really did surprise me, about walking in his beloved Alps and through open countryside. He loved nature, hunting, shooting, and fishing. He was an upper class gentleman in so many ways. He identified hundreds of species of flowers and plants. Another big surprise, as I was looking for Lenin the man, was to find that nearly all the important relationships in Lenin's life were with women, and not only emotional life, but political life too. He was surrounded by women. Lots of ruthless and cynical men are sentimental about their mothers, but Lenin had an incredibly close relationship with his mother, who he called simply a saint. There are hundreds of letters. He wasn't just a dutiful correspondent. He was an absolutely passionate one. And his two sisters, he couldn't have done what he did without the two sisters who supported him politically and emotionally, and who also as committed to the revolution as he was, spent time in jail and in exile in Siberia as he had done. He lived with his mother-in-law for 15 years, often in very small lodging houses and two rooms, and they got on extremely well. He was not exactly what one would call a feminist in a modern sense. He was a Victorian man of his era in lots of ways, but he took women as seriously as he took men. His wife, Nadezhda, is often seen as a household drudge, and is often written that way, or as just his secretary who corrected his sometimes very bad spelling. But there's much more to her than that. He would not have achieved half of what he did without her. There would have probably been no Bolshevik Revolution without her. She adapted his text, but most important, she kept his unbelievable rages in check, and she knew how to calm him down. When he got too wound up and too exhausted, she insisted they go on holidays walking in the mountains, and they took very, very long holidays. And she knew exactly how to keep him healthy and sane and operational. And I found another little-known side to his life, Lenin in Love, a story that was completely censored in the Soviet years, and few scholars in the West knew anything about it, was Lenin's fascinating relationship with a woman who was, for a decade, he had an on-off love affair, and off again love affair with a glamorous woman who I half fell in love with as I was doing my research. She was, and the story of his ménage à trois with she was called Inessa Arm, and sounds quite glamorous, and indeed her name has a kind of exotic flair because of the French connotations. And she was absolutely central to his emotional life, and indeed helped him very much politically. She was a considerable socialist thinker, an activist in her own right. But their relationship forms a long-running part through quite a large part of this book. because it was so important to Lenin. I'm not an expert in the area of ménage à trois, but I can assure you, but this seems to me an example of a love triangle in which all three people behaved in a civilized fashion. And again, I just want to read you a short passage, again, to get a flavor of what this woman, what she was like. She was by far the most glamorous of all the Russian émigrés in the radical circles of Paris. A sophisticated, chic 35-year-old with a slim figure, chestnut hair, and bright green eyes. She was exuberant, highly intelligent, witty, and invariably wore a smile on her face. Inessa Arm was altogether different, more striking, more vibrant, more overtly sexy than the run-of-the-mill Olgas and Tatianas who frequented the Bolshevik cafes and bistros of the Avenue d'Orléans. Even her French-sounding name had a hint of the exotic. She could talk as easily about the latest couture fashions as she did about Marx's theory of surplus value, and fluently in 4 languages. She dressed elegantly, always with a Parisian hat, and played the piano beautifully. She cut a dash like no other among the comrades of the left bank. Party members described her as ever cheerful and spoke of her happy dynamism. Nadezhda said that when she arrived, all of us became very attached to Inessa. She always appeared to be in good spirits. She seemed to radiate warmth. Another observed that Inessa, by her own admission, did everything in life with passion, revolutionary politics, and romance. And Inessa and Lenin's wife Nadezhda had an extremely close relationship that is very, very moving. The only time that Lenin was seen to cry in public or to break down completely in public was at Inessa's funeral, which was, she died about 3 years before Lenin did. And they'd formed, the wife and the mistress had formed a very, very close bond. When Nadezhda died, 15 years after Lenin, for all those years, she kept 3 pictures on her desk: her mother, Lenin, and a picture of Inessa Arm, Lenin's mistress. And all this was suppressed in deliberately by Stalin and the Bolsheviks, because Lenin had to appear as this pure man. When the famous sealed train that took Lenin to Russia from Switzerland, where he was in exile, when the first of the 1917 revolutions in Russia in February 1917 happened. The first 2 names on the list of passengers that Lenin insisted would accompany him was Nadezhda and Inessa. And her, in all the Soviet records, her name, you could see there was one something scratched out, and it was Inessa Arm's name. She had to be written out of history completely in the Soviet years. Lenin built a monstrous state, as we know, hence the title of my book, Lenin the Dictator, and he really was. And it was very much a part of his secretive, intolerant, slightly paranoid personality. But he believed he was an idealist. And in person, he wasn't a monster or a sadist or vicious. In personal relationships, he was invariably kind and very often very gentle. He was always polite, and he behaved like the upper-class gentleman of his upbringing. The leader of the first proletarian state was indeed a nobleman, of course. He wasn't vain. He hated pictures of himself, to see pictures of himself, which was ironic given the personality, the huge personality cult that was so much part of Soviet mythology for the next for 70 years until the moment the Soviet state collapsed. He wasn't cruel like Stalin or Mao Zedong or Hitler. He never wore uniforms or military tunics like so many dictators did. He never asked about the details, though he sent millions of people to their deaths. He never asked about the details of his victims' deaths, savoring the moment like Stalin used to do or Hitler. And to him, the millions of deaths were largely theoretical. He didn't see those individual deaths in my view. However, he built a system based on the idea that political terror was justified for the greater end. The system was perfected by Stalin, who used it more ruthlessly. But all the ideas were Lenin's, and the creation of the organs of repression in the state were Lenin. He created the Cheka, which then became the NKVD and then the KGB. He created the laws on which Stalin then sent millions of loyal communists to, as well as bourgeois, to their deaths or to the Gulag. From the first day of the revolution, Lenin knew and told his followers that that terror was absolutely necessary. Within hours, the deaths began, and indeed, so many communists afterwards said that was the moment the revolution began to fail. What happened was, after the 2 days of revolutionary excitement, Lenin needed some sleep after this coup, which very nearly did not succeed. And while he was sleeping, his deputy, Kamenev, issued a decree halting the death penalty on the front. And when Lenin woke up and returned to the Smolny Institute, which was the seat of power in the new Soviet Union, he heard what had happened. He flew into one of his absolute rages and said, "What on earth are you doing? This is complete madness. Do you not understand that you cannot create a revolutionary state without terror?" So all those who say, well, Lenin was the idealist and everything went wrong after he died, which has been an argument on the left basically for the last 70, 80 years, are under a delusion. It was Lenin's state, and it remained basically Lenin's state until 1991. He hadn't always been a bad man, but he did terrible things. And the worst of his evils was to leave a man like Stalin in pole position to lead the Soviet Union after him. That was a historic crime. Angelika Balabanova, one of his very old and trusted comrades for quite a long time until she started to loathe him, who was the original first secretary of the Comintern and the Socialist International, said, and I think this was a very perceptive remark, and Rick mentioned it, but cut the quote slightly short. Lenin's tragedy was that, in Goethe's phrase, he desired the good but created evil. And I think that is pretty much summed up a great deal of Lenin. I liken him in this book, which some critics have chided me on, but I regard him as rather like a religious leader. I know Marxism was all Marxists say, oh, there's no similarity between Marxism and communism and any religion, because Marxism is a scientific faith. But it depends on faith in the same way that a religion depends on faith. And Lenin believed he was saving souls, rather like a religious leader, say, in the 17th century, let alone some religious leaders now. It didn't matter how many heretics were burned. He was working for the greater good, and Lenin always had the greater good in mind, which is again one of his huge strengths as a political leader, was a strategic sense. And he was an absolute true believer, although, as I say, he could be pragmatic. And what communism? It's very hard for us to imagine it now, because even though the communist experiment ended not that long ago in historical terms, it seems like an age. It seems like an age ago. It's very hard to explain as a writer about this era and just what communism was and how it progressed. Sometimes you think the Cold War might have as well have been the Peloponnesian War, for all the resonance it has to anyone under about 45, I guess. But it's very hard for us to remember just how epic was the scale of the ambition of communism. It wasn't trying just to reorder society or economics. Its aims were almost spiritual in a sense, and Lenin and spoke about this very very often. The crux of what they were trying to do, and they believed that if you took away the idea of exploitation, that if you took away the profit motive, you wouldn't just be creating a fairer society. You would be creating a more noble, selfless human being. You were the idea of Soviet man, Soviet people. He wanted to perfect mankind. The problem was that people showed a very annoying, to him, a baffling a refusal to be perfected. So they then had to be coerced or bullied and terrorized into doing what the communists wanted. And it was because of the scale of the ambition of communism that showed the scale of its failure. And that really is the lasting legacy of Lenin. The Soviet experiment was a ghastly failure that left that disappointed all the hopes of perfection, of radical change, and left millions of people, scores of millions of people dead in bloody terror. So that's my case, and I hope there are lots of lively questions to follow.
Thanks a lot. I seem to recall that reading that Lenin enjoyed meeting children and the company of children. Was he a father? And if he was, what kind of father was he?
No, he wasn't a father. And this was one of the tragedies of his wife's. He did like children up to a point, as long as they weren't too noisy, and to stop him working. He loved like Rick and me. He loved libraries. Libraries were most of his life before everything else. He loved work at libraries, but he didn't have children. However, what happened after Inessa died, the mistress died, was that the mistress had 5 children, none of them Lenins. They were all born well before she met Lenin. But after she died, the Lenins became guardians of Inessa's 2 youngest daughters, which again was extremely moving and rather interesting. And Nadezhda grew to, both Lenin and Nadezhda grew to love them dearly. And Nadezhda wrote letters to the mistress's children saying, "My dear darlingest daughter," and which again I was very interested in that. But he wasn't a father. He was an uncle of one adopted. His elder sister Anna had one adopted child.
You mentioned that Lenin was a man of action. Crushing the White Revolution, the White Russians, was it due to him or to Trotsky?
Well, both is the answer. Lenin put Trotsky in charge of the Red Army to create the Red Army, in effect. But it was Trotsky was extremely brilliant, but Lenin had the strategic vision, and he'd never studied any military history at all until quite late in his life. But he had a real strategic vision, as it turned out, and he picked the right generals, and he let them basically get on with it. Again, using terror methods, using very, very typical terror methods with the army, because a lot of them were old Tsarist generals that they employed, and which was very controversial in the Communist Party at that time. Many of the members thought that what a terrible mistake this is. How can we elect the ghastly ruling classes generals run the army? But Lenin just said, well, they're the only ones who actually know what they're doing. So, however, to keep them loyal, he arrested their families and kept them in jail to make sure, and threatened to kill them if they didn't perform. So, but he was a man of action. I mean, the coup itself was a man of action, and this is why the real achievement of Lenin, and again, is that day of the coup. If it wasn't for Lenin, this completely disproves the Marxist idea that history is driven by broad, sweeping forces of social or economic forces. It wouldn't have happened without Lenin. He absolutely forced his members to go along with him to mount the insurrection in the first place. And most of them were absolutely reluctant. They didn't see that it would work. They all thought they'd be hanged from lampposts when it failed. And it was his driving force that pulled them along, that pulled the people along with him. So, and he said it had to be this particular day on the 25th of 7th of November, 25th of October, for tactical ends. So that, And then when it was looked like failing, it was it was total accident that this worked. People say that it was a brilliantly planned operation, but it wasn't. It was rather chaotic. They couldn't get the cannons to work, at the right time. They couldn't get the navy that was supposed to come up the river arrived a day late. I mean, it was totally chaotic, and it could just for 100 people, more people, or maybe 200 more people fighting for Kerensky in the provisional government and in the right places, it might not have worked, and Lenin would be a footnote in history, and there wouldn't be 600-page biographies written about him. But yes, he was surprisingly, for a man who spent so long in libraries, he was a man of action when it counted. There's a gentleman there.
Lenin's death, please. Something about his death.
About his death. Well, it was a long, lingering death. Basically, Lenin only had 4.5 years in real power, because he started having a series of strokes from 1921. And the last 18 months, he couldn't speak. He was bedridden, and power was ebbing away. He tried. He wanted someone to help him die, because he could see that what was happening. He knew what was happening to him. He asked at one point. He asked Stalin for poison to kill him. No. Stalin, of course, wanted Lenin dead more than anyone else wanted Lenin dead. However, he didn't want to do the deed himself and get blamed for it. So he refused to give him poison. But it was a long, lingering death with power, all the thing that he'd wanted and strived for all his life, ebbing away, going day by day to people who he thought were incapable of leading as he was. One of his big mistakes was to leave no real method of succession. He issued these testaments about who should take over and how he should take over, but he thought none of them were actually up to it compared to him. So there was always something wrong with anyone who was named as a possible successor. Trotsky, obviously Stalin, who was going to emerge as the most powerful, because Lenin had put him there. Lenin had given Lenin for all those again who say that it was all went wrong. The whole revolution was betrayed by Stalin. Well, it was Lenin who created Stalin and put him in position. But I found I found writing about the last days of Lenin really quite sad, because the doctors didn't really. It took them quite a long time to realize what kind of stroke it was. At one point, they thought it might be the end bit of syphilis, but it wasn't. But there he was trying. He had these convoluted. He had he kept trying to communicate with people, but couldn't. And there were records of his face just looking monumentally sad, and he was. It was not a happy death at all.
Victor.
Yes.
Victor.
Yes.
Over here. You described Lenin as the man who wanted good and created evil, and murdered lots of people, but was very kind and polite in his private life. Where do you put him on the moral scale, where 1 is absolute good and 10 is absolute evil?
I didn't say he wanted good, and it was one of his comrades who knew him well. Although I think it's a perceptive comment. up there as he was not a Stalin or a Hitler. I'm not sure I believe in this idea of absolute evil anyway. But if I accept the premise of your question for a minute, I'd put him up there with a 7 or an 8. But on a bad day, perhaps a 9. You know, on a bad day in the Civil War, one of the things when I said I grew to really sort of hate him, was because I was brought up in a kind of European leftist tradition that did slightly believe in this idea of Lenin the idealist and Stalin was the great betrayer. Even though intellectually I knew that probably wasn't true, emotionally I did sort of believe it. But when you see in his own hand, or the telegrams, verbatim, the number of times he said, shoot them, shoot them, shoot them, or, be merciless, underlined 3 times. And what he meant by merciless was merciless. It's chilling to actually see it in archives there, and these were his words, shoot them, shoot them. And that was one of his favorite terms, shoot them.
Yeah. I had a question.
Yes?
So I was just wondering as to what your research process was for this book, because as you said, there's no dearth of biographical literature on Lenin, and whatever information may not come to the fore would have a very tight iron grip on it by the Russian government right now. So as you were writing or as you were studying about Lenin, where and how did you find out things that hadn't been written about before, and how did you try to, or did you ever have to circumvent a certain, Russian political stranglehold on the information that you found?
Well, after 91 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of the archives did open, and including a lot of the party archives, and it's very hard for them to they did. In the last few years, they have closed some of them. But once you'd opened it, and a lot of scholars had seen them, it's difficult to close them again. What's emerged in the last 7 or 8 years? Lots of them put in the archives in some Western archives of people who were exiles from, who'd been close to Lenin. There are a lot of Lenin's letters that came to light again in the last few years that were in Russian archives that had been in an open archive, but nobody had seen them. With a Russian, it wasn't that it was just no one got round to it, or they were in some file, big file that no one had opened. So that was rather exciting. And a lot of the ones that I mentioned are about Lenin's letters to his mother and family. The more personal ones were in this archive that I was lucky enough to be able to get. However, I did have a slight problem with Russia. It took me, because of stuff I'd written before, particularly the book on the collapse of the Soviet Union. It took me a long while to get a visa for Russia. It took me nearly 6 months to get a working visa to Russia, because I had to go in there for all kinds of interviews. Anyway, I won't bore you with the reasons why, but it was a real process. But eventually I did get there, and I could get more or less what I wanted. Also, what had happened is after '91, the Hoover Institution in Stamford bought a lot of the copies of a lot of the archives of some state archives, but the Communist Party archives of this period, which again I knew that no one had really looked at properly. So I could do that, and there were lots of archives. There was lots of material that in Berlin that the Germans had bought. So there were ways of piecing it together, and I managed to get a lot of the information about Inessa Arm, for example, through family archives that I knew how to get around them that weren't in the Russian state archives. So, you can use a bit of detective work, and with a bit of official archives and a bit of just normal research methods, you can get what you want. There's some questions.
Is the mic? Okay. Hi. You said that one of Lenin's grave mistakes was that he created Stalin, and he was the reason why Stalin became the dictator that he was. But if we look at the dismissal letter of Lenin that came out after his death, saying that Stalin should not be part of the entire thing, and if we look at the power struggle, then can we really say that it's his mistake? To what extent can we say that it's Lenin's mistake?
Well, Lenin had made Stalin General Secretary of the Soviet Party. It was Lenin who'd been incredibly useful in the revolutionary moment before struggle before 1917. Stalin was the man who raised all the money got all the money for the Bolsheviks. He was the man the gangster who'd robbed all the organised the bank robberies, organised raids on Tsarist ships to get money. And afterwards, it was Lenin who put Stalin in all these positions, knowing what Stalin was like and what he was. By the time you're referring to the last testament, where he said Stalin was unfit, but this was in late 1922, 1923. It was way too late. By then, Stalin had already been general secretary of the party for 2 years. He had used all his powers of patronage to create his people around him, given all these people appointments. He'd frozen out Trotsky and some of the others. There'd been a triumvirate with Stalin, Zinoviev and Kamenev, who they were basically running the show when Lenin was on his long deathbed. And you refer to that, but all the other the rest of the testament, saying he dismissed all the others as being hopeless as well. He said Trotsky couldn't be a leader either. In one line, he said none of them were up to it. So I think most scholars stand by this line almost that Lenin created Stalin and created Stalinism, and the ideology was Stalin. All the institutions were Lenin's. Sorry? All the institutions of the Soviet state and the laws of repression were created by by Lenin immediately after the revolution. Stalin operated them more ruthlessly. There's a gentleman there.
So, ideologically speaking, was Leninism a kind of synthesis between radicalism and traditionalism? And why does Leninism fail?
Why does Leninism?
Why does Leninism fail in implementation? That is.
I think Leninism it's in a tradition of Russian radicalism, the intolerant, but the creation of a Leninist party, of a Bolshevik-style party, which Lenin said is the only way that you could create, was entirely Leninist and was entirely Lenin's idea and was not in a radical tradition. Most of the ideas in his mercifully brief, in his most powerful book, What Is to Be Done, of how you create, of how you seize power, how you influence the operation of parties in cells, which is still the way a lot of radical extremist groups operate. Even it's said, often said, that even ISIS operates in many places in that sort of way. And all that is Leninist. It is not in a long tradition of socialist ideology. Lenin's contribution was not so much ideological but practical, of how you actually achieve power and then how you keep it. He was not a great political thinker. He was not a Marx, not even a Trotsky. He created very little. What Lenin was good at was the theory and practice of power. He was a fantastic anatomist of power, but he wasn't a great thinker, a political thinker. Oh, I'm told that's it. That's my hour. Thank you very, very much. It's been a great pleasure.